Marcus Vance is a billionaire who thinks he can delete history. He crushed my daughter's medicine under his heel just because he could. But what he doesn't know is that I'm not just the woman who cleans his floors, I'm the only one who knows the secret that can bring this entire tower down. The marble floor of the Apex Development high-rise stretched before Elena Ramirez like a frozen sea. Her knees pressed against the Arctic white stone, the cold seeping through her uniform trousers and settling into her bones. She dipped the brush into the bucket of caustic soap, the chemical smell sharp enough to make her eyes water, and resumed her rhythmic scrubbing. 6 months ago, these hands had held a 13th-century psalter, its vellum pages so delicate she'd needed magnifying lenses and surgical gloves to repair the gold leaf illuminations. Now those same calloused fingers gripped a wire brush, attacking streaks of mud tracked across a floor polished to such perfection it reflected her bent form like a funhouse mirror. The rare book restoration market had collapsed when the city's historical society dissolved. The wealthy collectors who'd once paid premium rates for her archival expertise had pivoted to digital art and NFTs. Elena's workshop, a cramped but sunlit studio filled with leather working tools, archival glues, and centuries-old binding techniques, had shuttered within 3 months. The medical bills arrived faster than she could process the loss. Mila needed medication that cost more per month than Elena used to earn in 6 weeks. The specialized bronchodilators, the anti-inflammatory treatments, the emergency epinephrine injectors, each prescription chipped away at the small savings Elena had built over 15 years of meticulous craftsmanship. When the choices narrowed to keeping the workshop or keeping her daughter breathing, there had been no choice at all. So Elena traded her scalpels for mops. She took the only job available, cleaning the monument built to erase everything she'd once valued. The Apex lobby existed in a state of artificial perfection. Motion-activated lighting clicked on as she moved, each panel emitting a judgmental hum. The air was filtered and pressurized, scrubbed of any scent that might suggest actual human habitation. No coffee, no perfume, no trace of cooking or life. Only the faint ozone smell of expensive electronics and the chemical bite of the cleaning agents she wielded like weapons against invisible dirt. Elena's reflection stared back at her from the polished floor, a woman whose silver-streaked hair was pulled into a severe bun, whose weathered eyes, the color of aged parchment, had learned to see the original intent beneath layers of damage. She'd applied those restoration principles to herself. Preserve the core. Protect what remains. Survive. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She sat back on her heels, peeling off one wet glove to check the screen. Mama, the heat stopped again. Cold. Can't breathe good. Elena's chest constricted. The hearth, the century-old tenement complex where she and Mila lived, had been experiencing maintenance issues for 2 months. The radiators would clank and protest, then fall silent for hours. The building's owner had stopped responding to repair requests around the same time the eviction rumors started circulating. She typed quickly with pruned fingers, 15 minutes baby. Use the spare inhaler in the red box. She sent the message, returned the phone to her pocket, and was reaching for a brush when the lobby's glass doors swung open with a pneumatic whisper. Marcus Vance strode into the space as if he owned it. Which, Elena supposed, he did. He wore a charcoal wool overcoat that probably cost more than 6 months of her current salary, tailored so precisely it looked like armor. His movements were broad and deliberate, designed to command attention, to occupy as much space as possible. He smelled of sandalwood and winter air, a sharp, expensive scent completely at odds with the damp, earthy smell that clung to Elena's work clothes. Mrs. Ramirez. His voice carried across the empty lobby with practiced resonance. Good evening. Elena remained kneeling, brush in hand. Protocol dictated she stand, acknowledge, defer. She did none of those things. Mr. Vance. He crossed the distance between them, his leather shoes clicking against the marble she'd just scrubbed. When he stopped, his shadow fell across her like a judgment. I wanted to deliver this personally. He produced a cream-colored envelope from his coat pocket, holding it between 2 fingers as if the paper itself might contaminate him. Professional courtesy, you understand. Given our proximity. Elena set down her brush and rose slowly, her knees protesting. She was shorter than Marcus by half a head, but she met his gaze without flinching. His eyes were pale blue, cold as the marble beneath their feet. She took the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive stock. Inside, she already knew what she'd find: formal eviction notice, legal jargon, 14 days to vacate. The hearth has been scheduled for demolition, Marcus continued, his tone carrying a veneer of regret so thin it was nearly transparent. Urban renewal. The property has fallen below safety standards, and frankly, Mrs. Ramirez, you and your daughter deserve better than that crumbling relic. Consider this an opportunity. An opportunity. Elena repeated the words without inflection. Absolutely. The city is evolving. We're building a future here, not preserving a past. He gestured vaguely toward the glass walls of the apex, beyond which the lights of the city glittered like broken promises. Those old structures, they're monuments to inefficiency. They drain resources, they harbor poverty, they resist progress. Elena's fingers tightened on the envelope. My daughter can't breathe in progress, Mr. Vance. She needs heat. Stable housing. Medical care. Then perhaps you should have chosen a more sustainable profession. The condescension in his voice was a weapon, precise and deliberate. Book restoration. In this economy? That's nostalgia, Mrs. Ramirez, not a career. The words landed like blows. Elena's jaw tightened, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. 14 days, Marcus said, tapping the envelope in her hand. I trust you'll use the time wisely. As he turned to leave, Elena's phone buzzed again. She reached for it instinctively, her movements automatic, born of months of constant vigilance. The spare inhaler she'd told Mila to use tumbled from her pocket, clattering against the pristine marble. The small blue canister rolled across the floor, coming to rest near Marcus's feet. Elena moved toward it. Marcus shifted his weight. His heel came down on the inhaler with a sickening crack. Plastic splintered. The pressurized canister released its contents in a desperate hiss, white medication vapor escaping in a thin stream before dissipating into the filtered air. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silent lobby, the death rattle of her daughter's lifeline. Marcus lifted his foot, examining the crushed remnants with mild interest. How clumsy of me. His voice carried no trace of genuine apology. These floors are terribly slippery. Perhaps the cleaning solution is too aggressive. He looked directly at Elena as he spoke. His pale eyes were utterly calm, completely aware of what he'd done. I'm sure the pharmacy can replace it, he continued, brushing imaginary dust from his expensive coat. Though at this hour, in this weather. He glanced toward the windows, where snow had begun to fall in thick, wind-driven sheets. Well. I'm sure you'll manage. You're resourceful, after all. You have to be. He walked away, his footsteps echoing across the marble she'd spent 3 hours scrubbing. The glass doors whispered shut behind him, sealing the lobby back into its artificial perfection. Elena stood frozen, staring at the crushed inhaler. The medication it contained was specialized, expensive, kept in reserve for emergencies. The nearest pharmacy with the right formulation was 12 blocks away through a worsening blizzard, and even if she could reach it, even if they were still open, she couldn't afford to replace it until her next paycheck arrived in 5 days. Mila had one inhaler left. One. The phone buzzed again. Mama, where are you? Breathing hard. Scared. Elena's hands were shaking as she typed, coming now, baby. Hold on. She abandoned her cleaning supplies, grabbed her heavy restoration toolkit, a steel-reinforced case containing tools she could no longer afford to use for their intended purpose, and headed for the rear exit. The pharmacy was too far, the weather too dangerous. She'd have to get home first, assess Mila's condition, make decisions from there. The service alley behind the apex was a narrow canyon of brick and shadow, lit only by a single flickering street lamp. Snow swirled through the confined space, already accumulating in frozen drifts against the dumpsters. Elena pulled her thin coat tighter, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She'd taken perhaps 20 steps when she heard the voices. Filthy leech. Clearing the vista, remember. Boss wants the approaches clean. Elena paused, her restoration toolkit heavy in her hand. The voices came from deeper in the alley, where the light didn't quite reach. She should keep walking, should focus on getting home to Mila. Every second counted. She heard the wet sound of a boot connecting with flesh. A gasped exhale of pain. Her feet carried her forward before conscious thought could intervene. 3 figures occupied the darkest part of the alley. 2 wore the crisp navy uniforms of Apex Security, their bulk exaggerated by tactical vests and heavy winter coats. The third was a collection of rags and bones, an elderly man curled against the brick wall, arms raised to protect his head from the systematic beating being delivered by the larger men. Problem here. Elena's voice cut through the alley like a blade. The guards turned. One was young, broad-shouldered, his face flushed with exertion and cold. The other was older, leaner, his expression one of practiced cruelty. "Private property, ma'am," the older guard said. "Move along." "He's on the ground." Elena didn't move. "You're kicking him." "Pest control." The younger guard grinned. "Mr. Vance wants the area sanitized before the ceremony tomorrow. Can't have trash cluttering the golden shovel photo op." The old man shifted, trying to rise, and the younger guard's boot caught him in the ribs. The sound of impact, hollow, sickening, echoed off the brick walls. Elena's toolkit hit the younger guard's sternum before conscious thought could intervene. The steel-reinforced corner connected with his vest with a satisfying thud, knocking the wind from him. He staggered backward, surprise and pain warring across his features. The older guard lunged. Elena swung the heavy case in a tight arc, using the momentum to deflect his reaching arms. Years of lifting waterlogged manuscripts, of manipulating heavy binding presses, of maintaining absolute precision under physical strain, all of it translated into functional strength that surprised both men. She planted herself between the guards and the fallen men, the toolkit raised like a shield. "Back off," she said quietly. The guards hesitated, reassessing. The older one reached for his radio. Elena didn't wait for backup to arrive. She dropped to a crouch beside the old man, hooking her free arm under his shoulders. "Can you stand?" He nodded weakly, and together they stumbled toward a recessed service doorway 3 meters away. Elena backed into the shallow alcove, keeping her makeshift weapon raised, forcing the guards to approach through the narrow opening if they wanted to continue their assault. The old man sagged against her, his weight surprisingly light, as if age had hollowed him out from the inside. He was shivering violently, dressed in layers of torn fabric that provided no real protection against the cold. His skin, where visible through the grime, was translucent, mapped with veins and the deep lines of a life spent outdoors. Elena shifted the toolkit to one hand and shrugged out of her work coat, inadequate, threadbare, but warmer than what the old man wore. She draped it over his thin shoulders, feeling the cold bite into her own arms immediately. Her cleaning cart was visible near the mouth of the alley, abandoned in her rush. She gestured toward it. "Don't move." She darted out, grabbed her thermos, lentil soup, her own dinner, saved from lunch, and returned to the alcove before the guards could react. She unscrewed the cap and pressed the warm container into the old man's trembling hands. "Drink," she urged. He looked at her with eyes that didn't match his broken appearance, bright, intelligent, piercing despite the exhaustion etched around them. He lifted the thermos to his cracked lips and drank in small, careful sips. The older guard spoke into his radio. "Security to main lobby. Need backup in service alley 2. Aggressive vagrant situation." Elena's mind raced. Backup meant more guards, meant questions she couldn't afford to answer, meant delays she couldn't afford when Mila was alone and struggling to breathe 12 blocks away. She glanced at her abandoned cleaning cart. The industrial chemicals were still there, ammonia for heavy degreasing, bleach for sanitizing. Dangerous separately, potentially lethal if combined improperly, but in careful, controlled amounts. "Stay here," she told the old man. She left the alcove at a run, snatched the 2 bottles from her cart, and returned. The guards were advancing, confident now with reinforcements incoming. Elena could hear boots pounding on concrete somewhere beyond the alley, multiple sets, converging. She poured a small amount of ammonia into the thermos cap. Added an equally small measure of bleach. The chemical reaction was immediate, producing a localized cloud of pungent vapor that billowed outward, stinging eyes and searing lungs. The guards recoiled, coughing, hands flying to their watering eyes. Elena grabbed the old man's arm and pulled him toward a service hatch set low in the brick wall, a maintenance access she'd used before, had memorized during her months of cleaning the Apex's secret infrastructure. She knew these hidden spaces, these forgotten arteries, better than the people who claimed to own them. The hatch opened with a protesting screech of rusted hinges. Elena shoved her toolkit through first, then helped the old man crawl into the darkness beyond. She followed, pulling the hatch shut behind them just as the backup guards rounded the corner into the alley, their flashlight beams cutting through the dissipating chemical fog. The maintenance tunnel was pitch black, narrow, damp. Elena fumbled for her phone, activating the flashlight app. The beam illuminated crumbling concrete walls, exposed pipes bleeding rust, and a cramped passage leading deeper into the building's hidden bones. They crawled perhaps 50 meters before the passage widened enough to stand. The old man leaned against the wall, still sipping from the thermos, his breathing gradually settling into a less panicked rhythm. "Thank you," he whispered. His voice was a rasp of stone grinding against stone, but underneath ran a current of unexpected refinement. Not many would stop. Not many would need to, Elena replied, checking her phone. 3 new messages from Mila, each more desperate than the last. She typed quickly, 10 minutes baby, I promise. Use the blue pills in the bathroom cabinet if you need them. When she looked up, the old man was watching her with those 2 bright eyes. You have someone waiting, he said. Not a question. My daughter. She's sick. I need to. I know. He reached into the torn layers of his clothing, his movements deliberate despite the tremor in his hands. I've been watching the hearth for weeks. Watching you come and go. Watching the building die. Elena tensed, suddenly aware of how isolated they were, how little she knew about this man she'd just risked everything to protect. He produced something from a hidden pocket, a heavy object that gleamed dully in the phone's light. An iron key, its surface covered in thick orange rust, its teeth worn but still defined. My name, he said, pressing the key into her palm, is Silas Vance. The name hit Elena like cold water. Vance. Marcus's surname. I'm his father, Silas continued, his voice taking on a harder edge despite its weakness. The Apex. I designed every structural system, every load-bearing calculation, every failsafe. Built it with my own hands before Marcus was born. He didn't create this empire. He stole it. Poisoned every blueprint I gave him with cheap materials and shortcuts. Elena stared at the key, its weight somehow heavier than the iron warranted. This opens the master override, Silas explained. Sub-basement level, beneath the hearth. When I built this district 40 years ago, I connected everything, the old buildings, the new construction, the underground infrastructure. Safety measure. Marcus doesn't know it exists. He gutted my original plans, but he never found the override. Why are you giving this to me? Because the building is a trap. Silas's eyes glittered with something between grief and grim satisfaction. The Apex. Marcus built it on a foundation of greed and ignorance. The resonance frequencies, the load displacement, the harmonic vibrations, he ignored all of it. When he demolishes the hearth, the shock waves will travel through the bedrock, amplify through the cheap materials he used, and bring his glass tower down on his head. A low rumble vibrated through the tunnel walls. Elena felt it in her teeth, in her bones. Dust sifted from the ceiling. Silas gripped her arm with surprising strength. That's not thunder, Mrs. Ramirez. That's bulldozers. He's not waiting for morning. He's starting now, in the storm, before anyone can stop him. Elena's blood turned to ice. My daughter is in the hearth. Then you have minutes, not hours. Silas pressed the key harder into her hand. The override controls the structural supports. You can stabilize the building long enough to evacuate. But you have to move. Now. Elena ran. The lights died with a sound like a guillotine blade, a sharp, mechanical thunk followed by absolute silence. Elena had climbed 3 flights of the hearth's oak staircase when the darkness swallowed her whole. The emergency lighting flickered once, twice, casting skeletal shadows against the peeling wallpaper before surrendering to the black. Her hand tightened on the banister, the wood smooth and cold beneath her palm. The silence pressed against her eardrums. No hum of refrigerators, no distant television murmur, no rattling radiators. The building's pulse had stopped. Mila. Elena's lungs seized with the same panic her daughter must be experiencing 4 floors above. She fumbled for her phone, the screen's glow painfully bright in the sudden void. 2% battery. The text from Mila was 3 minutes old, "Mama, hurry, so cold." Elena typed with numb fingers, 2 minutes, baby, hold on. She sent the message and watched the battery percentage drop to 1. The temperature was already falling. Elena could see her breath materializing in thin clouds, pale ghosts in the phone's dying light. The hearth's ancient heating system depended on electric pumps to circulate the steam. Without power, the radiators would cool within minutes, the pipes would freeze within the hour, and the rooms, those high-ceilinged, drafty rooms built before modern insulation, would become meat lockers. Mila's lungs couldn't handle cold. The frigid air would constrict her airways, trigger bronchospasms, send her small body into respiratory distress. Elena had perhaps 60 minutes before hypothermia compounded the breathing crisis into something irreversible. The furnace. Silas had mentioned the heart, the central system, the override. Elena's mind worked through the building's architecture with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to damaged manuscripts. Sub-basement. 3 levels down from the ground floor. The original coal-burning furnace converted to oil decades ago but still functioning on mechanical principles. If she could restart the system manually, she could buy time. Get heat flowing, stabilize Mila, figure out the rest. Her phone screen went dark. Dead. Elena pocketed the useless device and continued climbing in absolute darkness, one hand trailing the banister, the other pressed against the wall. The building's geometry lived in her muscle memory now, 17 steps per flight, a landing turn to the left, repeat. She counted under her breath, her boots finding each step with careful precision. Somewhere above, a door slammed. Elena froze. Heavy footsteps echoed down the stairwell, multiple sets, moving with tactical coordination. The sharp click of equipment harnesses, the crackle of radio static. Marcus's security team. Thermal scan showing nothing on 6, a male voice reported, the words bouncing off the walls in distorted fragments. Moving to 5. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. They were between her and Mila. She'd have to circle around, use the south stairwell, lose them in the building's maze of corridors. But first, she needed to reach the basement, needed to get the heat running before Mila's condition deteriorated past the point of recovery. She reversed direction, descending instead of climbing, moving with a hunter's silence. The stairs grew colder as she dropped below ground level. Condensation formed on the walls, making the stone slick beneath her fingertips. The air tasted of minerals and rust, of a century's accumulated damp. The footsteps above grew closer. Elena heard the metallic scrape of a door being forced open, the guards checking each floor systematically. They were herding her downward, cutting off escape routes with military efficiency. A blue light swept across the landing 2 floors above, thermal scanner. Elena pressed herself against the freezing wall, absorbing the cold into her bones, willing her body temperature to blend with the surrounding stone. She'd seen enough nature documentaries to understand the principle: predators hunted heat signatures. Become ice, disappear. The scanner beam passed over her position without slowing. The guards continued their descent, their boots creating a rhythmic percussion against the oak steps. Elena reached the ground floor landing and paused. The main corridor stretched away into darkness, leading toward the south stairwell. But voices echoed from there too, more guards, converging from multiple directions. Marcus had deployed his entire security team. She was trapped between 2 forces with nowhere to retreat. Except down. Elena's eyes had adjusted enough to make out shapes in the darkness. The brass elevator doors stood 10 meters away, their Art Deco designs barely visible in the ambient city light filtering through distant windows. The elevator itself would be useless without power, but the shaft. The idea formed with crystalline clarity. Dangerous. Possibly suicidal. Her only option. She sprinted across the corridor, her restoration toolkit banging against her hip. Behind her, a guard shouted, "Movement. Ground floor, East Corridor." Elena hit the elevator doors hard, fingers scrabbling for purchase in the narrow gap between them. The brass was cold enough to burn. She wedged her fingers into the seam and pulled with desperate strength, the muscles of her shoulders and back igniting with effort. The doors resisted, groaned, then parted with a grinding protest of metal on metal. Darkness yawned before her, a vertical shaft dropping into the building's guts. The smell of machine oil and ancient grease rolled out in a wave. Elena leaned into the opening, her eyes straining against the black. Thick cables hung in the center of the shaft, disappearing into the abyss below. Flashlight beams cut across the corridor behind her. 30 seconds, maybe less. Elena gripped the doorframe, swung herself into the void, and caught the nearest cable in both hands. The metal was slick with decades of accumulated grease, cold as death. Elena's palms screamed as she began to slide, unable to maintain grip against the frictionless surface. She plummeted through darkness, the cable burning through her skin, her descent a barely controlled fall. She caught glimpses of each floor as she dropped past, rectangles of lesser darkness where the closed elevator doors broke the shaft's uniformity. 3 floors, 4, 5. The sub-basement had to be. Elena's boots hit water with a tremendous splash, the impact jarring through her knees and spine. She stumbled, fell to her hands in frigid, ankle-deep water. The shock of the cold drove the air from her lungs in a gasped exhale. She crouched in the darkness, breathing hard, listening. Above, the guards' shouts echoed down the shaft, their flashlight beams probing the depths. But the sound was distant, muffled by vertical space. Elena was in. The sub-basement stretched around her in every direction, a Victorian nightmare of rusted machinery and abandoned infrastructure. Massive boilers loomed like sleeping giants, their riveted surfaces bleeding orange corrosion. Pipes thick as tree trunks wove overhead, dripping condensation in a constant, maddening rhythm. The smell was overwhelming, sulfur and mineral deposits, machine oil, and century-old coal dust. A beam of light swept through a distant doorway. Guards on the sub-basement level, moving toward the elevator shaft to investigate the noise. Elena pressed herself behind a corroded pressure tank, its curved surface slick with moisture. She held her breath as boots splashed through the standing water, passing within 3 meters of her position. The guards' tactical lights carved bright wedges through the darkness, illuminating columns of rising steam. "Probably rats," one guard muttered. "This place is a death trap. Keep looking. Boss wants her found within the hour." The footsteps receded, the lights dimming as the guards moved toward the shaft. Elena waited until the sound faded completely before moving. Silas's instructions replayed in her memory: north wall, dead-end corridor, newer brickwork, hidden lock. Elena oriented herself using the building's geometry, the mental map she'd constructed during months of cleaning every floor. The furnace room would be northwest, the original foundation point where the building's first stones had been laid. She moved through the maze of machinery with surgical precision, her hands reading the darkness through touch alone. Cold pipes, hot pipes, the vibration of still-functioning systems translated through iron into her palms. The temperature fluctuated wildly, frigid near the outer walls, sweltering near the active steam lines. Her skin couldn't decide whether to shiver or sweat. The corridor materialized from the gloom, a dead end, exactly as Silas described. The brickwork here was newer, laid perhaps 30 years ago instead of a century. Elena ran her fingers over the mortar, searching for the inconsistency, the hidden mechanism. There. A depression in the joints, cleverly disguised. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. A brick came free, revealing a lock of intricate brass construction. The rusted key was solid weight in her pocket. Elena withdrew it, the metal warming against her palm. The key slid into the lock with a precision that spoke of master craftsmanship. Elena turned it slowly, feeling tumblers engage with soft clicks. The mechanism resisted at first, clogged with decades of disuse, then surrendered with a deep, resonant thrum she felt in her chest cavity. A section of wall swung inward on perfectly balanced hinges, silent despite its obvious weight. Warm air rushed out, dry, still, carrying the scent of vanilla and old leather. The smell of preserved vellum, of archival storage. Elena's restoration instincts recognized it immediately, a climate-controlled space, sealed from the outside world's humidity and temperature fluctuations. She stepped through the opening into the architect's sanctuary. The door slammed shut behind her with a boom that shook the floor beneath her boots. Elena spun, threw herself against the iron-reinforced surface, but there was no handle on this side, no mechanism to reverse the closing. The counterweight system Silas had built was absolute. Outside, muffled shouts. The guards had heard the sound, were converging on the location. Elena heard them hammering against the door, heard their frustrated curses as they failed to find any way to force entry. She was safe from them. And trapped. Elena turned toward the interior of the sanctuary, her eyes adjusting to a new quality of darkness. Emergency lighting, old-fashioned oil lamps with automatic ignition, flickered to life along the walls as her movement triggered mechanical sensors. The flames grew, casting warm yellow light across a space far larger than she'd imagined. The architect's sanctuary was a cathedral built of knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves lined every wall, each one filled with leather-bound ledgers, rolled blueprints, document cases sealed with wax. The collection represented decades of record-keeping, a complete history of the hearth and the surrounding district. The air was perfectly dry, maintained at ideal archival conditions by machinery Elena couldn't see but could hear, a distant mechanical breathing, steady and eternal. In the center of the room sat a massive furnace, its cast-iron body decorated with ornate Victorian flourishes. But this wasn't a simple heating system. Brass pipes extended from it in every direction, connecting to instruments Elena had only seen in museums, pressure gauges with porcelain faces, valve wheels engraved with mathematical formulas, and what appeared to be an antique difference engine, a mechanical calculator with thousands of brass gears. The furnace's pilot light burned with steady blue flame. Heat radiated from the iron body, maintained at perfect operating temperature despite the building's power failure. This system ran on principles older than electricity, more reliable than digital control. But Elena's attention was drawn away from the machinery to the archives. Something about the organization, the careful labeling, called to her restoration instincts. She approached the nearest shelf, reading dates embossed in gold leaf on leather spines. 1873. 1884. 1891. Her fingers traced the spines until she found the volume she sought, 1884, the year the hearth's foundation had been laid. She pulled the heavy ledger from the shelf, carried it to a reading desk illuminated by 3 oil lamps, and opened it with the reverence she'd once reserved for illuminated manuscripts. The pages were vellum, real animal skin, properly prepared and bound. The ink was iron gall, still crisp and black after nearly 150 years. Elena's trained eye catalogued the craftsmanship even as she read the words. Founding members and blood tithes of the Hearth estate. The list of names began with careful calligraphy. Elena scanned down the entries, her pulse quickening. 7th from the top, Arthur Blackwood, master mason and keeper of the foundation. Her great-great-grandfather. Elena's hands trembled as she turned pages, reading the detailed accounts. Arthur Blackwood hadn't simply helped construct the hearth. He'd designed its foundation, engineered its systems, and bound his family line to its maintenance through a contract Elena was only now beginning to understand. The term keeper appeared repeatedly. Responsibilities outlined in meticulous detail, maintaining the furnace, monitoring structural integrity, ensuring the building's energetic requirements remained balanced. The language grew strange as she read deeper, mixing engineering terminology with phrases that sounded almost mystical. The hearth requires blood of its builders to remain stable. A keeper must reside within its walls to maintain proper resonance. Should the line be broken, the foundation will begin to fail. Elena's mind raced. Mila's illness had begun 6 months ago, shortly after they'd moved into the hearth. The sudden respiratory problems, the sensitivity to temperature, the way her condition improved in certain rooms and worsened in others. What if it wasn't illness at all, but the building responding to the presence of its hereditary keeper? What if Elena's return to the hearth had awakened something that required her daughter's participation in a contract written before either of them was born? A sound cut through her spiraling thoughts, a sharp click from the shadows beyond the lamplight. Elena's head snapped up. Her hand moved instinctively to her toolkit, fingers closing on a heavy bookbinding hammer. A shadow moved near the back of the sanctuary, detaching itself from the deeper darkness surrounding the furnace. Footsteps approached with measured confidence, boots clicking against the stone floor. A figure stepped into the circle of lamplight. Elena's breath caught. The person was dressed in clothes decades out of fashion, a canvas work coat patched with leather, trousers held up with suspenders, heavy boots caked with old mud. But it was the face that stopped Elena's heart. The features were hauntingly familiar, a mirror of the photograph she'd seen in her mother's albums. The same sharp cheekbones, the same weathered eyes, the color of aged parchment. The stranger regarded Elena with an expression of grim recognition. In their hand, they held an iron key identical to the one Silas had given her. "Welcome home, Elena," the figure said, their voice carrying the resonance of stone grinding against stone. "We've been waiting for you to remember." The shadow resolved into something mechanical, sleek black carbon fiber, four rotors humming with predatory precision. A security drone. Elena's breath caught. The machine hovered at eye level, its crimson optical sensor sweeping the sanctuary in methodical patterns. The oil lamp's flames reflected off its polished surface, creating dancing red points of light across the vellum-covered walls. She'd seen similar models during her restoration work at the museum, private security units equipped with facial recognition, thermal tracking, and non-lethal deterrent systems. Non-lethal to healthy adults. Potentially deadly to someone already compromised by cold and exhaustion. The drone rotated toward her position near the reading desk. Its sensor locked on, the red glow intensifying. Elena's hands were shaking, not from fear but from the cold seeping into her bones despite the furnace's heat. Her fingers fumbled with the toolkit's latches, the metal slippery against her numb skin. She'd studied the architecture of these drones during a museum security consultation 3 years ago. They relied on delicate gyroscopic bindings, intricate gear assemblies smaller than watch mechanisms. The drone advanced, rotors kicking up decades of accumulated dust from the floor. Elena's restoration instincts cataloged the movement patterns, compensating for drift, maintaining altitude through constant microadjustments. Fragile. Precise. Vulnerable. She grabbed a slender steel awl from her toolkit, designed for piercing leather, perfect for reaching into tight mechanical spaces. As the drone descended to scan her face more closely, Elena lunged forward, driving the awl upward into the housing between two rotors. The steel point found the gyroscope assembly. Elena twisted, her wrist remembering the exact motion she'd used 1,000 times to set binding rivets. Something inside the drone crunched. The machine lurched sideways, its rotors screaming in discordant protest. Elena wrenched the awl free and struck again, this time targeting the opposite rotor housing. The primary stabilization gears shattered with a sound like breaking glass. The drone dropped, bounced once off the stone floor, and lay sparking in a growing pool of leaked battery fluid. The crimson sensor dimmed to black. Elena crouched beside the wreckage, breathing hard, watching for any sign of continued function. The rotors twitched once, twice, then stopped. Disabled. But Marcus would receive the drone's last transmission, location, target identification, system failure. He would come. The drone's impact had jolted a floor panel near the furnace's base. Elena noticed the edge protruding upward, revealing a gap in the stone. She crossed to the furnace and knelt, her hands finding purchase in the narrow seam. The panel resisted, its edges sealed with decades of mineral deposits. She wedged the awl into the gap and pried. The stone panel lifted with a grinding protest, revealing a brass-bound console beneath. Not modern circuitry but an antique control system, toggle switches mounted on porcelain bases, copper wiring insulated with cloth, heavy iron levers connected to mechanical linkages that disappeared into the foundation itself. The master override. Tucked behind the console, secured in a leather sleeve green with age, lay a thick stack of parchment. Elena extracted the documents with trembling fingers, her restoration training screaming warnings about handling fragile materials without proper environmental controls. She spread the pages across the console's flat surface. The top sheet bore official seals, wax impressions in crimson and gold, still intact after more than a century. Calligraphic text in iron gall ink declared, Heritage Mandate for the Preservation of Historical Districts, City Charter Amendment 17, enacted 1883. Elena's eyes scanned the dense legal language, her mind translating the archaic phrasing. The mandate established permanent protection for certain landmarks, listing specific coordinates and architectural features. She found the hearth's address 3 pages in, accompanied by detailed specifications, sub-basement mechanical systems designated immutable landmark status. Structural modifications prohibited without Heritage Council approval. Her hands moved faster now, pulling documents from her toolkit, the eviction notice Marcus had delivered, printed copies of his demolition permits she'd photographed during a desperate research session weeks ago. She compared the modern paperwork to the Heritage Mandate's coordinates. The discrepancies leaped out. Marcus had claimed the basement fell outside protected zones due to documented structural decay. But the Heritage Mandate explicitly listed the vault as an immutable landmark, its coordinates precise to within 3 meters. Elena examined the demolition permits more closely. The digital signatures used a font, Calibri, that hadn't existed when the permits were allegedly notarized. The date stamps showed inconsistencies, approvals granted before applications were supposedly filed. This wasn't administrative error. This was systematic fraud. Marcus had forged every document, manipulated every timestamp, created a digital paper trail designed to withstand casual scrutiny but not forensic analysis. With the physical Heritage Mandate as evidence, Elena could dismantle his entire operation. His permits were void, his construction illegal, his real estate empire built on falsified foundation. She gathered the documents, her mind already constructing the legal argument. But as she straightened, her flashlight beam caught something else, a heavy rotary phone bolted to the vault wall near the furnace, its brass housing tarnished but intact. Elena crossed to the phone and lifted the receiver. She expected dead silence, the weight of disconnected wire. Instead, a faint dial tone crackled against her ear. Her heart hammered. Emergency services. Legal authorities. Someone who could stop Marcus before. She dialed with shaking fingers, 911. 3 rings. 4. Elena pressed the receiver hard against her ear, listening through decades of accumulated static. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was distant, filtered through failing infrastructure, but clear enough to understand. Elena spoke in a rapid whisper, conscious of how sound might travel through the building's bones. I'm trapped in the basement of the Hearth apartment complex, 1517 Morrison Street. The building owner, Marcus Vance, has committed permit fraud. I have physical evidence, the original Heritage Mandate protecting this site. He's attempting to destroy the evidence and... Ma'am, slow down. You said you're trapped. Are you in immediate danger? He cut the power. It's freezing. My daughter is upstairs, alone. I need police, building inspectors, someone who can. Ma'am, I'm showing your location as the historic district. Is anyone injured? Not yet, but... Ma'am, I need you to listen carefully. The dispatcher's tone shifted, professional warmth draining into flat apology. We have a level 4 weather emergency in effect. All non-essential emergency response has been suspended. The storm has grounded every vehicle. We're experiencing whiteout conditions with wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour. Elena's stomach dropped. How long until? We can't provide an accurate estimate. Current projections suggest conditions won't improve for at least 12 hours. I'm documenting your call and flagging your location for priority response once the roads are passable. Until then, you need to stay where you are, stay warm, and avoid confrontation. My daughter. If she's mobile and conscious, have her shelter in place. Do not attempt to travel in these conditions. The static grew worse, transforming the dispatcher's voice into metallic fragments. Ma'am, are you still? Connection is, stay safe. The line died. Elena stood with the receiver pressed to her ear, listening to empty silence. The dial tone didn't return. Outside the vault, the blizzard continued its assault on the city, transforming streets into impassable white canyons. No ambulances. No police. No rescue. She was alone. A metallic groan echoed through the basement, the sound of the stairwell door being forced open. Heavy footsteps descended, deliberate and unhurried. Elena replaced the phone receiver with careful silence. She gathered the Heritage Mandate and her toolkit, retreating deeper into the vault. The oil lamps cast her shadow across the mahogany shelves in distorted, dancing shapes. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Stopped. Resumed, moving toward the vault door. A voice carried through the iron barrier, Marcus's voice, stripped of its usual practice charm. The drone transmitted your location before you killed it. Clever work for a cleaning woman. Elena remained silent, her back pressed against the shelving. Through the vault door, she heard the scrape of metal on concrete. You've caused considerable inconvenience, Mrs. Ramirez. Breaking into restricted areas, destroying private property, accessing confidential documents. These are criminal offenses. The scraping continued, something heavy being dragged across the floor. I'm disappointed. I thought we had an understanding about efficiency. About progress. A pause. About knowing your place. Elena's grip tightened on her toolkit. The vault door was solid iron, 3 inches thick. Marcus couldn't breach it quickly with hand tools. But he didn't need to enter. He only needed to. The first impact sounded like a gunshot. The entire vault shuddered, dust cascading from the ceiling. Elena's eyes snapped toward the sound's origin, not the door but the exposed water main running along the corridor outside. Marcus was destroying the infrastructure. The second impact was followed by a high-pressure hiss. Water. The ancient pipes, carrying city water at tremendous force. Elena heard Marcus grunt with effort, heard the sledgehammer connect again and again with systematic precision. He was shearing off the valves, the couplings, the pressure regulators that kept the system stable. Water began seeping under the vault door within seconds, a thin sheet spreading across the stone floor, seeking the lowest point. The vault sat at the foundation's deepest level. Every drop of water in the corridor would eventually drain here. Marcus intended to flood the sanctuary. Drown the evidence. Drown Elena in the process. The water climbed to 1 inch, 2 inches. Elena watched the Heritage Mandate on the console begin to darken at its edges where spray had reached the vellum. The parchment would disintegrate within minutes of submersion. Even if Elena survived, Marcus's fraud would dissolve into illegible pulp. She splashed toward the master override console, her boots sending up small waves. The water reached her knees as she studied the controls, reading the engraved labels by lamplight. The system was more complex than she'd initially realized, not simple mechanical switches but an integrated infrastructure management network designed to regulate power, water, heat, and structural support throughout the district. Her fingers found a row of toggle switches labeled drainage. She flipped them one by one, hearing distant pumps attempt to engage. But the system had no power. Marcus's sabotage of the main lines had cut electricity to the emergency systems. Unless she could force power from somewhere else. Elena's eyes found a heavy iron lever near the console's base, its handle wrapped in cracked leather. The engraving read, Emergency Sublevel Purge, Heritage Failsafe Protocol, activate only under direct threat to Foundation integrity. The water reached her waist. The oil lamps flickered as their bases submerged. Elena threw her weight against the lever, pulling with every ounce of remaining strength. The lever moved with glacial resistance, decades of rust fighting against her effort. Elena braced her boot against the console base and hauled. The lever gave suddenly, slamming downward with a metallic clang that resonated through the entire foundation. The floor began to vibrate. Deep within the building's bones, massive mechanical systems awakened. Elena heard gears engaging, felt the thrum of hydraulic pressure building through stone and iron. The drainage pumps weren't simply activating, they were consuming power at a catastrophic rate, demanding energy the dead electrical grid couldn't provide. The console's pressure gauges began climbing into red zones. The needles trembled, pushed past their maximum ratings. Elena watched in growing horror as the system began cannibalizing electricity from the surrounding district, routing every available watt into the basement's archaic induction motors. Outside the vault, beyond the flooded corridor and shattered water mains, the city's power grid began to fail. The transformation was audible, a cascading series of transformer explosions, each one creating a dull thump Elena felt through the floor. The distant hum of the city, normally omnipresent even in the basement, died. Through ventilation gaps, she saw flashes of blue-green light as electrical systems overloaded and burned. The drainage pumps roared to full power, creating a suction force that pulled water through floor drains with tremendous violence. The flooding reversed within seconds, the vault floor emerging from the receding tide. But the price of that victory spread through the darkened city above. Elena stood shivering in the emptied vault, the heritage mandate clutched to her chest, listening to the absolute silence that follows catastrophic infrastructure failure. She'd saved the evidence. Preserved the sanctuary. Protected herself from Marcus's attempt at drowning. And in doing so, she'd plunged the entire district into darkness. 3 blocks away, in the Apex Hospital's intensive care unit, life support systems monitoring Marcus's elite investors fell silent. Ventilators stopped. Cardiac monitors went dark. Backup generators, neglected through years of cost-cutting, failed to engage. Elena had won the battle. The cost of victory would haunt the city for years to come. The vault door exploded inward with a sound like tearing metal, the blast wave sending centuries of accumulated dust spiraling through the lamplight. Elena pressed herself against the mahogany shelving, her eyes fixed on the jagged opening where 3 inches of solid iron had been. Marcus stepped through the breach, a thermal lance still glowing orange in his gloved hand. The tool hissed as he set it aside, the cutting edge dripping molten metal onto the stone floor. His expensive coat was dusted with frost and debris, his pale eyes scanning the sanctuary with predatory focus. He found Elena within seconds. She stood near the reading desk, her silhouette framed by the towering archives, the heritage mandate clutched against her chest. "Impressive," Marcus said, his voice stripped of its usual corporate polish. "I didn't think you had it in you. Breaking and entering, destroying property, triggering a city-wide blackout." He moved deeper into the vault, his footsteps echoing. "You've become quite the criminal, Mrs. Ramirez." Elena remained still, her weathered eyes tracking his movements with archival precision. She catalogued every detail, the tremor in his left hand, the way his breath came in shallow bursts, the desperation leaking through his carefully maintained facade. "Where is it?" Marcus demanded. "The original ledger. The Foundation records." Elena's fingers tightened on the document in her arms. "Protected. Protected." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and brittle. "You're standing in a flooded basement during a blizzard with no phone, no power, and no rescue coming. What protection do you imagine you have?" He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, reaching for the leather-bound volume Elena held. She twisted away, but Marcus was faster, stronger, fueled by weeks of mounting pressure as his empire threatened to collapse. His hand closed on the book's spine and wrenched it from her grasp. Elena stumbled backward, catching herself against the reading desk. She watched Marcus clutch the ledger to his chest, his expression transforming into something between triumph and relief. "This," he said, holding up the volume, "is the last piece of a dead world. Paper records, hand-drawn maps, ink signatures, relics of inefficiency." He turned toward the massive furnace dominating the center of the vault. Its cast-iron door stood open, revealing flames that painted the walls in flickering orange. "You spent your life restoring the past, Elena. Let me show you what the future does to history." He crossed to the furnace, the heat radiating against his face as he positioned himself before the opening. The ledger's leather binding absorbed the firelight, appearing to glow from within. "Do you understand how insignificant you are?" Marcus continued, his voice carrying over the furnace's roar. "A woman who repairs books in a world of cloud storage. A cleaning lady who thought she could challenge a billionaire. You've spent your entire existence among dead names and forgotten documents, invisible to everyone who matters." Elena straightened slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the reading desk. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the defeat Marcus expected. Instead, it possessed the rhythmic clarity of someone explaining a technical process to a particularly slow student. "I'm not a restorer, Marcus. I'm a conservator." Marcus paused, the ledger still raised toward the flames. "What?" "Different disciplines. Elena's fingers drummed against the wood, a nervous habit she'd never managed to break. Restorers fix damage. Conservators understand materials, their composition, their reactions, their chemistry. We anticipate deterioration before it happens. Fascinating, Marcus said, his tone dripping with condescension. Are you trying to bore me to death before I destroy your evidence? I'm explaining why the book you're holding is worthless. The words hung in the superheated air between them. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his grip on the ledger tightening. Elena continued, her voice steady. You're predictable. Wealthy men with something to hide always choose fire, dramatic, permanent, satisfying. So I prepared for you. She gestured toward the volume in his hands. The genuine ledger is in a fireproof compartment. What you're holding is a decoy I spent the last hour creating. Marcus's face transformed, rage bleeding through the cracks in his composure. You're lying. Throw it in. See what happens. For 3 heartbeats, Marcus stared at Elena, searching for deception in her weathered features. He found only calm certainty. With a snarl of frustration, he hurled the ledger into the furnace, the leather binding catching fire immediately. The flames turned green. Not the blue-green of burning copper wire or the yellow-green of certain alcohols. This was emerald, brilliant, unnatural, impossible to ignore. The chemical reaction Elena had engineered using copper sulfates and carefully measured salts created a beacon that transformed the furnace into a signal fire. The green light spilled from the open door, painting Marcus's shocked face in sickly luminescence. What did you? Visibility. Elena moved away from the desk, circling toward the vault's entrance. The ventilation system in the hearth was designed in 1883. The ducts run vertically from this vault to the roof vents. Any significant light source down here becomes visible from the street. Above them, beyond the vault's ceiling and the building's multiple floors, the emerald plume shot through the ventilation system like a supernatural flare. The green glow erupted from the external vents, cutting through the winter fog with otherworldly intensity. Across the frozen district, in a carefully chosen observation point, Silas saw the signal and reached for his radio. Marcus lunged toward Elena, but she was already moving. Years of navigating cramped workspaces and handling delicate materials had given her an economy of motion Marcus's broad, performative gestures couldn't match. As he passed the massive book press, a cast-iron mechanism used for flattening warped manuscripts, Elena seized the weighted handle and threw her entire body weight against it. The press slammed shut with tremendous force, catching Marcus's wool sleeve between the iron plates. The mechanism locked with a mechanical click, pinning his arm against the stone wall. He thrashed, trying to tear free, but the press was designed to exert tons of pressure. His expensive coat held firm, trapping him. You, Marcus's voice rose to a shout, but Elena was no longer listening. She crossed to a ventilation duct near the ceiling, barely visible behind a shelf of archived blueprints. During her weeks mapping the building from Silas's original plans, she'd identified this particular passage, a service duct predating Marcus's modern security installations. The opening was narrow, designed for maintenance access rather than human passage, but Elena had spent a lifetime contorting herself into cramped spaces to reach damaged bindings. She climbed onto a sturdy oak table, its surface scarred by centuries of scholarly work. Her fingers found the duct's edge, and she pulled herself upward with the same surgical precision she'd once used to separate adhered vellum pages. The space beyond was black and cramped, the metal cold against her palms. Behind her, Marcus screamed threats and promises, his voice echoing off the vault's walls. Elena ignored him, crawling deeper into the darkness, following the mental map she'd constructed from architectural documents Marcus had never bothered to read. The sound of boots hitting the vault floor reached her as she navigated the first junction. Heavy, tactical, moving with purpose. The authorities had arrived, drawn by the emerald beacon burning through the winter night. Police, investigators, journalists, everyone Silas had been carefully preparing for weeks. Elena emerged from the duct system 3 minutes later, dropping into a service corridor on the hearth's ground floor. The hallway was dark, cold, but familiar. She moved through the building's skeleton with the confidence of someone who understood its bones. By the time the police freed Marcus from the book press, Elena had vanished into the labyrinth of the hearth's interior, leaving behind only her carefully prepared evidence. The genuine heritage mandate lay in its fireproof compartment, accompanied by a stack of handwritten instructions. Elena's notes were precise, technical, grounded in the analog systems that predated digital infrastructure. She documented the manual override sequences for the district's power grid, the physical relay locations, the mechanical switches Marcus's corruption had bypassed but never eliminated. Because Marcus had infected the city's digital systems with logic bombs, malicious code designed to prevent restoration, the authorities couldn't reboot using computers. But Elena's paper instructions provided an alternative path. City engineers followed her ink-on-vellum directions, manually activating the ancient failsafe Silas had built into the foundation decades ago. Power returned to the district in stages, building by building, as workers flipped switches and threw levers according to Elena's detailed diagrams. Heat flowed through pipes. Lights flickered to life. The life support systems at Apex Hospital re-engaged, their backup generators finally receiving the manual restart commands Elena had outlined with surgical clarity. Marcus was led from the hearth in handcuffs, photographers capturing every moment of his public unraveling. The man who'd built an empire on digital manipulation was undone by paper, by physical evidence he couldn't delete, by archives he couldn't corrupt, by a conservator who understood that some truths could only be preserved in ink. The charges mounted quickly: corporate fraud measured in millions, reckless endangerment of public safety, attempted destruction of protected heritage sites. The ledger Elena had saved contained original signatures and financial records Marcus believed he'd successfully erased from existence. Each page was ammunition for prosecutors who'd been building their case for months, waiting for physical evidence to emerge. 3 weeks later, Elena sat in her living room, a fire crackling in the restored hearth. The radiators protested their familiar metallic song, the building's pulse resumed. Mila played near the window, her breathing steady, her color healthy. The specialists had finally diagnosed her condition, not illness but sensitivity to the building's dormant state. Once the hearth systems reawakened fully, Mila's symptoms had vanished. A knock at the door announced Silas's arrival. He entered slowly, his canvas coat dusted with fresh snow, his eyes bright with their usual terrifying intelligence. "They've designated it official," he said, lowering himself into the chair Elena offered. "Heritage site status. Protected in perpetuity." Elena nodded, watching Mila trace patterns on the frosted window glass. Through the pane, the city stretched away in glittering towers, the skyline punctuated by construction cranes and glass facades. Marcus's empire was being dismantled piece by piece, his projects investigated, his permits revoked. "Regrets?" Silas asked, his gravelly voice carrying genuine curiosity. Elena considered the question, her weathered eyes reflecting the firelight. She thought of Marcus in his holding cell, of the hospital patients who'd nearly died because of her actions, of the heritage mandate now safely archived in climate-controlled storage. "He wanted to build higher," she said finally. "Bigger towers, taller monuments, everything reaching toward the sky." She turned from the window, meeting Silas's gaze. But he'd forgotten how to read the foundation. Silas smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his leathered features. Hard to construct a skyscraper when you've lost the ability to understand what's holding it up. Elena returned the smile, her hands, calloused from labor, stained with archival ink, folding in her lap with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd preserved something essential. Not revenge. Rectification. The restoration of balance between the gleaming lie of progress and the heavy truth of history. Outside, snow continued to fall on the hearth and the city it anchored, covering everything in fresh white, preparing the foundation for whatever would be built next.